Hey guys, so I'm actually drinking today this wine. It's called Carnivore. It's a Cabernet Sauvignon and it's from California. And the reason I chose this wine today was because the case we're going to talk about happened in California. It's the Manson Family Murders. So Charles Manson was born on November 12th, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 16-year-old prostitute named Kathleen Maddox. When he was born, he actually didn't have a name, so his mom didn't register him with a name, so his actual birth certificate says no name Maddox. And how sad is that? Like, imagine being born and you don't even have an identity. He must feel like his mom didn't care enough to give him a name, and who knows what she was going through at the moment. But weeks later, she finally named him Charles Miles Maddox. But she was also dating at the time this man, William Manson, who ended up giving his last name to Charles, and that's how he ended up with the name Charles Manson. His mom was young and she was a heavy drinker and she was getting in trouble, and she actually ended up going to jail for 5 years for committing a robbery with her brother. And Charles Manson had to end up going to stay with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia, and he was getting in and out of trouble himself. Like most people who end up being criminals, and not all, but oftentimes we see that people who have a faulty relationship with their parents sometimes end up committing crimes. That's not everybody, but it is a common factor that we see a lot of times in criminals. So by the time he was 13, he had been sent to prisons and detention centers for youth. So the first school that he actually got sent to was the GVALT School for Boys, which was a juvenile detention center. It was in Terre Haute, Indiana. And Charles Manson was smart, okay? He was smart. He ended up escaping 2 times from the GVALT school. First time he escaped, he was caught by the police, and then the second time he escaped, he actually left to go find his mom. But when he got to the house, she actually ended up calling the police and sending him back to the school, which just imagine could be so traumatic for him that he ran away to find her, and then she just didn't want him and sent him back. But then we also have to consider the other perspective, that maybe she thought that being in this detention center was what's best for him and this where he was going to get the most help. I don't know. I just feel like he probably felt very distraught about it. So he kept in this mood, in this rhythm of getting sent to schools. He actually got sent to a couple more schools. One was the Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska. The third school he got sent to was the Indiana Boys School, where Charles Manson himself has said that he was brutally abused and raped by some older boys and some of the guards there. And that's just very traumatic. He was young at the time, very impressionable, and then getting into trouble, and then, suffering something as horrific as rape and abuse, somewhere where he felt that he was stuck in, is just, it's just terrible. Nobody deserves that. Not even Charles Manson. And so I think that that's maybe the beginning, or somewhere in that he started to feel like abandoned by the world, and that, nobody cares about you, getting into that mentality of you have to fend for yourself because nobody's going to care about you. So from the Indiana Boys School, he actually was so smart. He figured out how the system worked. He figured out what he needed to do. And he ended up escaping multiple times from this boys' school. He finally ended up escaping with an older boy that was at the school as well, and they left, and they ended up stealing cars and holding up gas station, and he was, committing petty crimes. I hate to say petty crimes because, stealing is not a petty crime, but he was just committing these petty crimes, and he got sent to jail. And then he was in and out of jail, and by 1967, he had spent more of his life in jail than he had out on the street with his family, living a normal life. So he was very much a criminal at heart. He knew how the system worked. He knew what he had to do to get in and out. Even afterwards, he said that he didn't want to leave prison later on in his life once he was convicted of the murders, because that's what he knew. So he was a criminal. That's all he knew. You know, he had been getting sent to these reformatories and detention center for boys ever since he was little, and I think he kind of adapted into this criminal mentality. That's all he knew. That was his life. It was where he felt comfortable. When he got out of prison, he actually ended up meeting a woman who was pregnant with his child, and then while he was in prison, he found out that she had left him for a trucker. And so I think this is another just like blow to him, where it's like, wow, like really nobody cares about me. Like, you know, like no one's gonna love you. Everybody's gonna leave you. And he just like got more heartbroken, I think, at that point. So then he was kind of living this like bohemian hippie lifestyle, like living on the streets and, you know, not having a permanent residence. And then he started getting followers. So it was mainly adolescents that may have run away, that were into drugs, and they just mainly hung out, you know, smoked some weed, did some LSD, which was one of the main drugs that they were consuming, playing music. Charles Manson was actually, you know, a musician. He played the guitar and he wrote songs, he sang pretty well, actually. I listened to a couple of his songs on Spotify and they're not terrible. It's almost weird to listen to it because you know you're listening to Charles Manson, but they're not terrible, I don't think. So he ends up with this family, is what he calls them, right? His family. And they're bouncing around, you know, they're living this like kind of lifestyle. And then they end up in Spawn Ranch. It's kind of where they settled on a resident location. And a lot of ex-members had said that Charles Manson would make the female members of the group have sex with the owner of Spawn Ranch in exchange for letting them live there. You know, he himself has said in the past that he had been a pimp, he had sold some girls, you know, but he did manipulate some of his members into selling themselves to get other things such as food, cars, like a place to live. So finally, when they settled in this Spawn Ranch, which actually was a filming set that they would use for movies, but by then he had kind of like a lot of family, which he called. Some of the main members of that was Charles Tex Watson, Linda Kasabian, Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Robert Buscelli. He began telling them about Helter Skelter. And so Helter Skelter, we know, is one of the Beatles songs on the White Album, but also he had manipulated his group into thinking that there was going to be a race war between whites and blacks, and that him and his family were going to hide out while the whole race war played out. And then when it was over, they were going to come out of hiding and they would be the only ones left to kind of rule over everybody else, and then basically they would be in charge. And these kids, they were all drugged up on LSD and they were infatuated with Charles Manson. They believed everything he said, so they believed him. And so in order to spark this race war, prosecutors say that Charles Manson convinced them to, you know, commit some murders and blame it on black people, which is, first of all, fucked up. Like, who does that? I don't know if that's necessarily true. I don't know if that's what Charles Manson actually planned. That's what the prosecution said he did. But we'll get into that later. First murder was committed on July 27th, 1969, and it was actually a man by the name of Gary Hinman. And he was a man who had introduced Charles Manson to Terry Melcher, who was a music producer. He worked with the Beach Boys, and he at first had listened to Charles Manson's music and he liked it. He had seemed interested, and then he kind of backed out. He just wasn't feeling it and just backed out. And that very much angered Charles because he wanted to be like an artist. He wanted to be a singer. You know, he claims that he never wanted to be a star or to be in the public eye, and he just wanted to be left alone. But at the same time, he was also very mad that he didn't get this big break. He was one of the first people that were killed. And then on August 19th, 1969, Tex, Susan, Linda, and Patricia went to 150 Cielo Drive. This residence was previously where Terry Melcher resided, and Charles Manson had been there before when Terry lived there, but now it was being rented out by movie director Roman Polanski and his then 8-month pregnant wife, Sharon Tate. So they went there, and the first person that was killed that night was 18-year-old Stephen Parent, who was actually visiting a caretaker that lives on the grounds to sell him stuff. But he, you know, it was just being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And he was in his car when he got shot 4 times by Tex Watson. Linda Kasabian ended up being the lookout, so she didn't go into the house. She just stayed out and was kind of, you know, just making sure nobody came, and she would alert them if anybody, because they thought, you know, suspicious activity or whatever. So they actually entered the home. Roman Polanski was in Europe at the time, and the only people that were home was Sharon Tate, and she actually was entertaining some friends at the time. So she had over Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, who was the heiress to the Folger coffee empire, and her then boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski. I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Linda's outside, and then Tex, Susan, Patricia end up tying ropes around their neck, and they had put them in the living room. So Jay was the first person that was murdered. He was shot and stabbed to death. Abigail and her boyfriend were able to escape, and they managed to get to the front lawn until they were caught up with by Tex Watson and Patricia Krenwinkel, and they stabbed them to death in the lawn. Inside the house was Sharon Tate, who was heartbreakingly begging for the life of her child to be spared. She begged them, even at one point, take her, just let her have her baby, and then they could kill her. She was, you know, doing anything to try to save herself and her baby, and unfortunately she was stabbed to death 16 times. And the coroner actually said that 5 of those wounds were fatal wounds. So this was complete overkill. They stabbed her. They had no remorse, no consideration that she was pregnant, even when she was begging. That's just so horrific, like, to think about. You know, she was probably so excited to be a mom, and she was almost there. She was 8.5 months pregnant, like I said, and it's just so tragic. So not only did they murder all these people, but then Susan Atkins actually wrote the word pig in blood that she had used from Sharon Tate's body to kind of stir up like this political war that they were convinced was going to happen because of Helter Skelter that Charles Manson was telling them. They wrote that on the wall, and they figured once the police saw that they would blame maybe African Americans, and then it would start a race war. So the very next night, on August 10th, 1969, because Charles Manson believed that the murders the previous night were kind of sloppy, he decided to go with some of the members of his family, Tex Watson, Susan, Patricia, Linda Kasabian, Leslie Van Houten, and one of the members who was named Stephen Clem Grogan. And they drove to Lino LaBianca's house. He was a supermarket executive, and his wife, Rosemary. So Manson, this was the first time he actually participated. So him and Tex tied up Lino and his wife in the living room. And then afterwards, he claims that he didn't participate, but, you know, he tied them up. What did he think was going to happen? I don't know. And then he decided to leave. He decided to leave the house, and he left with some of the members of the group, only leaving Tex, Leslie, and Patricia to stay. and they are the ones who ended up staying and committing the murders of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca that night. They were also stabbed to death, and then this time they did the same as they had done the previous night with Sharon Tate's blood. They used the blood of the victims to write on the walls, "Death to pigs and helter skelter." And this time it was Patricia Krenwinkel that actually wrote on the wall. Time had passed, and then the Manson family was actually raided by the police at their ranch, but not for the murders, but actually for unrelated charges, such as the police were convinced that they were stealing cars, which they were, and so they arrested them for that. During their arrest, it was actually Susan Atkins that was in her jail cell, and she told her cellmate that she was involved in the Tate LaBianca murders, and she was kind of just, boasting about it, wanting to seem like she was tough and somebody to be scared of, because she was one of the people that committed these murders. And then, the cellmate told on her and kind of ratted her out. By December 8th, 1969, Charles Manson, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian were all indicted for the murders of Tate and LaBianca. And then also Leslie Van Houten was indicted for the murders of Lino LaBianca and Rosemary LaBianca. So trial began on June 16, 1970. Linda actually decided to testify for the prosecution. They gave her immunity for her testimony against the family, and she decided to do this because she didn't actually participate in the murder per se, but she was there and she was the lookout. She, believed that because she didn't kill anybody, she testified against the family, that she could get immunity, which they did give to her, which is total bullshit. It's not fair, okay? She was there, she knew what happened, she didn't tell anybody, and then, they were supposed to be this family, and then instead she decided to testify against them. Don't get me wrong, they should all be in jail. She decides to testify against them. By the time the jury deliberated, it had gone on for months at this point. On January 25th, 1971, Manson and his family were convicted of the Tate and LaBianca murders, the 9 murders that had happened, and they were sentenced to death. So California at the time had the death penalty. However, the following year in 1972, they got rid of the death penalty, reducing all of their charges to life in prison. By this time, they had been indicted. People were outraged, understandably so, that they were going to get the chance to live in prison and not, have to go to the death penalty. At this time, it was when Charles Manson, he was, still very strong with his family. The girls of his group had actually carved swastikas because he himself had carved a swastika in his head and shaved off his hair. And his followers from the outside did the same thing. They all carved swastikas in their forehead and shaved their head. And he received a lot of support on the outside. Even, some of his family members that were indicted with him, besides Linda, were, supporting him, and they didn't want to testify against him. I want to know what you guys think. So I think, like many criminals, I think that Charles Manson had a very troubled childhood. He didn't know his father, his biological father. His mom was a 16-year-old prostitute. He had mentioned before in a book that was written by his cellmate, which is called Charles Manson in His Own Words, that his mom had tried to sell him for a pitcher of beer once. And actually, when I read that, I thought, so the lady that wanted to buy him, she wanted to be a mom. And sometimes I think, she wanted to be a mom so bad. Imagine if she would have stayed with him. Maybe he would have had a better childhood. I don't know. But obviously we can't blame his mom. She was young, and she was an alcoholic, a heavy drinker, and into crime. She could have a terrible childhood as well, and then we just see the cycle kind of repeat itself. And so I'm not justifying anything Charles Manson did. However, he fought very hard to say that because he didn't actually murder anybody, that he shouldn't have been indicted for the murders that the rest of his family had committed, and he stayed true to that until he died in prison in 2017, actually days after his birthday. So I don't know. I think that nothing happened in that ranch that Charles Manson didn't approve of or didn't know of. I think that he had a very strong hold on them. Some people claim that he's a serial killer because they just kind of lump him in with, you know, the Ted Bundys and Jeffrey Dahmers in the world, but he actually is not a serial killer that we know of. Okay, so there are speculations of different people that they think that he murdered, but he did not commit any of the Tate LaBianca murders. So I don't know. Do I think he should be in jail? He should have been put in jail? Yes, I do. I think that he was a very dangerous man and that he did deserve to go to prison. And I don't think that he wanted to stay on the outside. He had said even in interviews before that he didn't want to be released. He had many parole hearings, all which were denied, of course. But he even said that he didn't want to be released. I think by then he had been in prison so long, and, you know, ever since he was a young boy, he had been in correctional centers, and this is the life he knew. I don't think he was really prepared to live like a normal life outside of crime. I think he was used to the prison system, and I think that prison actually gave him structure that he never had growing up as a child with his mother, with his family. And I think that prison actually kind of, you know, gave him that structure that maybe he needed, and that's why he never wanted to be released, even though he would, you know, petition for release from the courts. So let me know what you guys think about this case. I think we should always remember the lives that were taken those nights and always remember them. I feel so bad. Like, every time I hear this story, it just makes me want to cry thinking about Sharon Tate and how she was pregnant and she begged for the life of her child, and they were just murdered in cold blood because somebody told them to do so. But I don't know. I think everybody has their own opinions on this case, but let me know what you guys want to see next.